Good evening, everybody. Hope everybody's doing well. I'm coming to you from Toano, Virginia, and we're excited to have George Snook here tonight. The Manuscript Society was founded in 1948 as the National Society of Autograph Collectors, and it includes not just collectors but also manuscript curators, librarians, dealers, auction houses, and has members around the world and members from every continent: Asia, Australia, Europe, North America, and South America. The Manuscript Society encourages the collection and preservation of manuscripts and documents to stimulate and aid collectors in their various collecting specialties, and facilitates the exchange of information and knowledge among collectors, scholars, dealers, and the general public. In addition to the Manuscript Mondays, the Manuscript Society also publishes a quarterly journal, Manuscripts. I just received mine in the mail this afternoon, so I'm looking forward to reading it. And a quarterly newsletter, the Manuscript Society News. The Society also has a scholarship program, and it's named after Richard Moss. It's the Richard Moss Research Grant. It awards up to $10,000 or $10,000 to currently enrolled graduate students to support research in original manuscripts. The deadline for this past year has ended, but it will be available. More information will be on the Society website coming up for the next year's. Finally, the Society holds an annual meeting, and it is a wonderful way to meet other collectors and those interested in manuscripts and documents. And we see behind the scenes visits to memorable museums and manuscript repositories and libraries. This past year was held in Boston, and next year, 2027, it will be held in Chicago sometime in May. I'm not exactly sure the dates. I know it's been decided. But anyway, if you're interested in joining the Manuscript Society, please check out the website. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to George Snook. He is a retired educator, a retired teacher, and the current vice president of the Manuscript Society. And he has agreed to be here tonight to talk about his collecting of drug literature and artifacts. And he has begun assembling them as early as the mid 1960s. An impulse purchase of a De Quincey's English Opium Eater in a used bookstore in London sparked a lifelong interest in drugs and their influence on culture. This journey has led him to consider how drug experimentation has shaped literary and musical traditions, criminal justice systems, and the treatment of ethnic and cultural minorities. George is a resident of New York City, but also has a farmhouse in Massachusetts, a couple dogs, some cats, and an 8-year-old granddaughter. You can see from his bio that they tell him what to do, but he stays busy. He completed his MA in European history in 1975 and retired in 2021 after a career in teaching. But without further ado, take it away, George. Tell us about your collection on drugs.
All right. Thanks, Jay. And thanks, Lee. I appreciate it. Thank you all for signing up and coming in tonight. Yeah, this one, The Origins of Drug Culture, I wanted to start with this famous Tennille painting because I figure everybody's seen that one from Alice in Wonderland. And there's a certain mystery about it, which is, was Lewis Carroll aware that he was alluding to sort of psychedelics in describing Alice talking to this hookah smoking caterpillar? And, we will never know the answer, but it appears he probably was, because there was a book published that we know is in his collection by Mordecai Cook about 5 years before. It was published in 1860, 5 years before, and we're pretty sure he consulted the copy in the Oxford Library as well. So when he was telling Alice to eat from one side and grow small, and eat from the other side and go tall, and all the adventures that ensued, he might have been thinking in terms of psychedelic mushrooms. Anyway, what I wanted to start this conversation with was a little bit of the background history, and all the major drugs we'll be touching on tonight are all plant-based. Even LSD, the precursors, are to be found in ergot mold, which comes from spoiled rye plants. And as such, drugs have really been part of human civilization for about 5,000 years that we can clearly prove, and probably a lot earlier than that. I know there's been traces of opium found in pottery in Neolithic Spain. We have references, 5,000-year-old references in China, medical texts. Egyptian mummies have been found to have THC in their soft tissue. Herodotus talks about the Scythians using cannabis. We've found in the Altai Mountains, Eurasian bodies buried with cannabis. Cyprus was famous in ancient times, the times of Odysseus, for its opium production. And the New World had its own types of drugs that were available in the form of cacti and mushrooms. Anyway, this particular print I found it in a bookstall in Paris, and it's from a 1847 book, as you see, called Les Fleurs Animées, which animated pictures of plants in the form of women, and it's odd, but all the other depictions show them as very, very colorful. And then you get to opium, and everything's gray and black and everything else. Even though, as you can see from the picture of the plant next to it, it's a very colorful plant, but it's certainly a dark reputation. Anyway, going to America, the United States, that was a guy named Granville who did that book, by the way. Going to America, this is a book called Land of the Saracens by Bayard Taylor, who was a poet and a writer and a diplomat and everything else. He a world traveler, and he wrote a book. This book, Land of the Saracens, was contains the first references to recreational use of marijuana in the United States. And it's actually kind of a little bit of an object lesson contained in that. Apparently, Bayard went to Egypt and tried some hashish there and didn't have much of an effect. So he felt a little overly confident, and he went to Syria. And in Damascus, he decided to go looking for some hashish to experiment with. And he met some Syrian who gave him some and gave him a dose. And he took it, and about half an hour later, apparently nothing happened. So he did that kind of rookie mistake, and he said he took 5 more doses. And I guess 2 days later, he was still feeling ill and swearing off ever touching drugs again. So he was well known in New York bohemian circles. Even though he was from Jersey, apparently he used to go into the village and meet the other bohemians there. So sort of like modern times in a bit. Anyway, the next book is probably the most famous of the early 19th century treatments of hashish in cannabis in the United States. And it was written by Fitzhugh Ludlow, who had read De Quincey's Opium Eater and decided that he would do an American version with hashish. And in 1857, he published this book. He was a bohemian and hung out in what is today NoHo in Manhattan with people like Walt Whitman and others. And he just went down to his local pharmacy and picked up cannabis indica and would drink this stuff and then go off to the theater and everything else. And he wrote this book, 1857. The copy I have here is actually from 1903. And this is the second edition, and it's notable because Aubrey Beardsley did the illustrations for it. So there's the hashish. By the way, he died at the age of 34. And he experimented with a lot of drugs, so he might not have been in the healthiest of conditions. But traveling out of the United States and going to Europe, I wanted to draw attention to Baudelaire, who was the French Romantic poet who wrote Les Paradis Artificiels, or Artificial Paradise. And he was one of probably the most noted of the French Romantic poets. And the rest of these romanticists who love nature and the exotic and the Oriental and all these other fantasy lands, but lived in downtown Paris. They were sort of champions of anything they could find that was exotic and unusual. And he was associated with Charles Dumas, Eugene Delacroix, Victor Hugo, Théophile Gautier, and these guys would gather in this Hotel Pimodin, and in this sort of informal group they called the Club des Hachishans, and experiment. And I wanted to draw your attention that this hotel still exists. It's the Hotel de Lausanne, and it's on the Ile de Saint Louis. And this particular edition of Artificial Paradise is actually a 1922 German edition. But he's probably one of the most famous of the early proponents and critics of drug use. My favorite, though, of these 19th century guys is this man, Sir Richard Burton, who was quite a wild man in his own right. He did more to popularize Victorian Orientalism than probably anybody else. He was a writer, a translator, a spy, a diplomat. He was an explorer. He was one of a couple men who tried to discover the source of the Nile. And he missed the source of the Nile, but he did run into Lake Tanganyika and found the source of the Congo River. But in these Arabian Nights, there is, obviously the stories of Sinbad the Sailor and Aladdin and his magic lamp. And there's also a number of stories that deal with hashish eaters, from the Persian folklore and Syrian folklore and Arab folklore, and they're usually for comic relief. Although every now and then they're presented as having a kind of unusual take on reality, and some sultan will consult them for their kind of idiosyncratic take on existence. But that's a collection of the Arabian Nights that he wrote. Of course, these Europeans who were experimenting and Americans with drugs, all they had to do was go down to the local pharmacy and pick up a bottle of Mrs. Winslow's syrup, which incidentally was made for teething children, and no doubt their mothers as well. These things were loaded with opium, and you just bought them over the counter. And I was fortunate to find both a copy of an original advert, but also an empty bottle of one in an antique store a while back. But of course, this was for the children. The grown-ups simply had to go into the pharmacy and they could buy their drugs right there. It's a bottle of cannabis indica. It's probably the same brand that Fitzhugh Ludlow obtained. And then there's a bottle there of opium tonic that you would have been able to purchase over the counter. And then after 1844, when the syringe was invented, you could go off for your evening and with your own syringe and stash of morphine and cocaine. Well, cocaine you'd have to wait till after 1860, but these were what was there. The cocaine was interesting because that became increasingly, that took off like wildfire. Literally, it was first refined from coca leaves to what we think of as cocaine in, I think, 1860. And went wild after that, largely through the enthusiastic endorsement of people such as Sigmund Freud, Arthur Conan Doyle, and even Pope Leo XIII. The original formula for Coca-Cola was made of cola nuts and cocaine. And there was even a wine, a Bordeaux, mixed with cocaine solution that the Pope endorsed called Vin Mariani. It was estimated by 1902 that there were over 200,000 cocaine addicts in the United States using it regularly. Now, I've included Robert Louis Stevenson here for, yeah, I think it's actually, in my book, the best 19th century fictional treatment of drug addiction, bar none. The book itself, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, does not reference cocaine specifically, but Dr. Jekyll, the kindly doctor who's interested in his patients and living a good, clean life, goes down to the local pharmacy and picks up this stuff and goes back and experiments on himself. And, within a matter of a few weeks, he can't put it down. It's taking over his life. He's transformed into this bestial, small, evil creature called Hyde that eventually murders people and ends up dominating Jekyll and until the good doctor is dead. This particular copy is an illegal pirated, it's a bootleg version. The United States had no copyright deals with England, so the minute a book was published in England that looked popular, these book companies in New York would immediately pirate them and sell them. And this one was actually printed in 1886, which was the very year that Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde first edition came out. And according to the historical record, Robert Louis Stevenson wrote this book after a 6-day binge on cocaine. Or he wrote it in 6 days during a binge on cocaine, I should say. So much for that. So around 1900, it was pretty obvious that drugs were very, very popular throughout much of the Western world, and indeed were becoming perceived by some to be a threat to society, and certainly a menace to the addict's health and everything else. This is a print of the La Morphiniste by Eugene Grasset in 1897. Governments reacted pretty soon after 1900. And started clamping down on the access to the drugs. In 1914, the Harrison Narcotics Act meant that only doctors from that point, physicians, could prescribe drugs like heroin, cocaine, and morphine. I should mention heroin came in around 1898, I think, somewhere around there. It was discovered by the Bayer Company in Germany, for which we're famous for Bayer aspirin, of course. At any rate, with the law cracking down, it was very, I think it's important that we recognize that along with the fear of public health, fears for public health, there was also a sense that immigrants and foreigners were bringing these poisons to Western sensibilities or Westerners. And so a lot of the anti-immigration, anti-foreign sentiment around the turn of the century played into the anti-drug sentiment at the time. And I thought for a couple of examples of that, I would show these. The book by Sax Rohmer called Dope is alongside of the books, the whole Fu Manchu series. Invariably, it's a Chinese crime lord who is using drugs, opium-based drugs, to try and seduce white women into prostitution. I mean, it's a familiar kind of approach in all of these sensationalistic novels. This other one over on the right was this is a translation. It was originally in French, called Musk, Hashish, and Blood. That came out in 1930. Hector France was a French author who had been in North Africa in the French military, and he wrote this book, which went through a number of editions, which is pretty much about what the title says. It's all about the North Africans and drugs anyway. So let's see. Oh yeah, here's some artifacts that you might find interesting. I've The lower right, the picture is of an opium den in San Francisco in the late 1800s, and there was a wave of anti-Chinese sentiment at the time, and the idea that the Chinese were all gathering in these opium dens. And I found this in an old print shop. It's a hand-colored print from the late 19th century. San Francisco made a municipal law outlawing opium dens in 1875, which I think is interesting because the opium dens were outlawed, but you could go to a pharmacy and get your laudanum or your opium tonic over the counter there. At the top is a classic opium pipe that I found in a Chinatown antique store. Oh my God, about 50 years ago, 40, 50 years ago. And at the my lower left on the screen, that little container was actually found at an archaeological site in Shanghai, and that's a sort of a one-off individual amount that was meant to hold opium, a personal amount. It's a tiny little thing, and there's a 1 gram weight from Thailand that would be used for weighing opium. And so we got some artifacts there to look at. Let's see, what else? Of course, it's funny that everybody's blaming the immigrants and the foreigners for drug use, when of course the Westerners had no problem finding it on their own. And this book right here is written by Jean Cocteau, Diary of an Addict in 1932. This is the first English translation of it. He was a playwright, a poet, and a filmmaker. Did most noteworthy films were Beauty and the Beast and Orpheus. And he had a rather long-standing addiction. And the book's interesting because it treats both the pleasures of opium use, but also the pain and difficulty of dealing with an addiction. And on the left is obviously a photograph of opium pods and the flowers. Good. Let's see. What else we got here? Oh yeah, back to North Africa. North Africa was its proximity in Morocco, especially its proximity to Europe, made it sort of the bearer of cannabis culture, if you will, to Europe. And Europeans from Delacroix up to, as I show you in this picture, Keith Richards and the Rolling Stones, went to Morocco to sample the hashish that was there. And I found an old postcard from the late 19th century of Moroccans there. There's one in the middle carrying an old flintlock, and then someone smoking a pipe and someone cutting up some of the cannabis. Some pictures of dried cannabis and then the processed hashish above it. The unique pipes that are used in North Africa are called sepses, and that's one right there. It's the same one you'll see in the picture that Keith Richards is smoking of the Rolling Stones, and the same basic style that you see the gentleman on the left in the postcard smoking. But that's where sort of Europeans were blaming the Moroccans for that. In the United States, of course, it was Mexicans that were blamed for bringing drugs to America. Anyway, this is an interesting work that was published in 1930 called An Essay on Hashish. It was written by Dr. Victor Robertson. It's rather unique. 1930. Rather unique in that it's coming out at a time when there is a great deal of anxiety and criticism about the use of cannabis. And this actually was a series of experiments he did and came up with largely a positive opinion of its medicinal value. As I say, a rather unusual one, but there's still that element of Orientalism right through there on the cover, where to eat that drug and dream all day of the maids that live by the Bengal Bay. So that's the Victor Robinson book. All right, what else we got? So anyway, we hit 1900s, and the law starts cracking down. There were municipal and state laws against all these drugs before the federal government stepped in. But 1937 was a really interesting year because that's when the federal laws against marijuana were put in place in the form of a tax act. And I picked up this copy of the Bureau of Narcotics Traffic in Opium and Dangerous Drugs book. I was fascinated because it was the actual date, 1937, that caught my eye, because it has the first information in it about marijuana going illegal. And therefore, it has actually descriptions of the first people in the United States arrested for possession or sale of cannabis on a federal level. And in reading it carefully, it's kind of interesting. I'll read you the names of the people that were first arrested for marijuana on a federal basis. And I think the message is obvious. Moses Vaca, Juan Moyne, Jose Gracia, Pete Lopez alias Mexico Pete, and Octavio Carrillo. So, clearly they're targeting a certain audience or a certain group of people there. And the photographs on the left, those are from a book on criminology I have. That's not from the same text, but all of if you look at that people, it's just a sample page of people arrested around the turn of the century for opium abuse or heroin abuse. And the woman was also charged with prostitution. There are 3 Chinese gentlemen there, 1 black man, and on the lower right-hand side is an elderly Irish-American gentleman. But he's, it's clear where we were aiming at that time. And of course, in cities like New York with large Black populations, by the 1930s, jazz was really associated with cannabis and heroin usage. And a number of the more famous jazz musicians of the day were again either charged or associated with the use of drugs. Charlie Parker, as you see on the left with the saxophone, Lady Day or Billie Holiday, who ran against the law and whose career was wrecked by the restrictions that were placed on her about playing in clubs in New York and everything else because of her arrest record. Gene Krupa, who was arrested for marijuana. Mez Mesro, a clarinetist, he's the author of the book Really the Blues, which is a fascinating study of pot and the jazz scene in Harlem in the 1930s. Mez was a white man who was moved to Harlem, was Louis Armstrong's roommate, and claims to have been the original subject of the old jazz song "The Reefer Man," and a particular kind of high quality marijuana was actually named the Real Mez in honor of Mez Mesro. And let's see, so that's it. And this next one I owe you a disclaimer on. I don't own that particular poster. That poster is I got a copy of it from the Harlem Jazz Museum, and it's a famous map of Harlem that was published in Cab Calloway's autobiography. And I missed my shot at getting a copy of that, a signed copy by Cab many years ago. It's the one item I regret not buying. But it's this wonderful poster that shows where a lot of the more famous jazz clubs were in Harlem. The Club Hot Cha, Gladys, Clam House, the Log Cabin, the Cotton Club, the Savoy Ballroom, Connie's Inn, the Lafayette Theater, all clustered in about a 4-block area. And if you look closely, at the left hand, the eastern or the left-hand side of the screen between 131st Street and 133rd, you'll see two guys talking to this funny little man. And that funny little man is the reefer man. He's selling reefers for $1 each, and then you were supposed to meet with him and then off to one of the clubs. One of the neatest thing, though, to me about this map is if you look on 133rd Street, about halfway down the street, you'll see there's a small little club called Tilly's. And the coolest thing of all is Tilly's does not exist, but that building was bought by a man named Bill Saxton, who is a retired saxophonist who lives in Harlem. He bought that building, noticed there was a stage in his living room, did some research, and found that he had bought the original site of Tilly's Speakeasy. And that was where Billie Holiday played her absolute first gig ever. And Bill Saxton has turned that into the last true speakeasy in New York City. And you can go there, and for $30 cover charge, you can hear the finest young musicians in Harlem. He gets a new group of people in every weekend, and it's BYOB. And if you go there, it's recommended that you don't bring a bottle of expensive wine. You bring a bottle of Jack and sit back and enjoy the show. But that's still in operation today. It's the last speakeasy. So that's my plug for Bill's place. Anyway, throughout the 1940s and the 1950s, the criminalizing of drug use and the spread of heroin usage was quite dramatic. And movies came out at the time. The Man with the Golden Arm, which you see is Frank Sinatra portraying a heroin addict. The book, The Addict in the Street, is firsthand testimonials of drug addiction in the streets of New York. And the people, Larner and Tefferteller, were actually helped create one of the most important local-based rehab centers in New York that's still operating to this day, the Henry Street Settlement, very, very famous. And even marijuana busts. We're getting some of the celebrities. On the right-hand side is a photograph of Robert Mitchum, who got caught in 1948 with a couple of reefers and sent off to jail for a few, I think it was 30 days or a couple of months, but that's him in his prison outfit sweeping the floors. Anyway, the basic attitude in the country at this point was that drug addicts were criminals, and they had to be treated either with punitive prison sentences, long-term incarceration, cold turkeys, and or mental institutions. So it was not a sort of a medical treatment that much, except for the Lafayette, the farm in Lexington, Kentucky, which did treat it as a medical problem. At any rate, the 1950s and the 1960s, I've written here the dam breaks, because that's basically when drug culture exploded in the United States, and we really see the sides divide up rather dramatically. I've included this little Uncle Sam, can you pass the acid test card? It'll be a little clearer as we get into this. But, I would emphasize that the media played a huge role in the spreading of both fear of and attraction to drugs in this time period. Some samples of that. The pulp fiction stuff that you see on the left there, where they're available everywhere, and the right-hand side is the more sort of sensationalist Time special life report with a cover that is clearly sensationalizing the use of heroin. But I was struck by the fact that these pulp fiction things did exactly the opposite of what they were intended to do. There was no way you were going to take some 14 or 15-year-old kids, show them covers like this, and not expect that they were going to get attracted to whatever substances were being talked about. On a personal note, that one at the bottom, I had to search that one out. I had to find that one because I remember seeing that one, Run Chico Run, in my grandfather's house and reading that when I was about 10 or 11 years old and being utterly fascinated by it. There's the pulps anyway. Alongside of the sensationalistic literature that was coming out was also the movies. And if you think of some of the movies that were made in the 1950s, A Rebel Without a Cause, The Wild Ones, and my personal favorite, High School Confidential, totally glamorized, juvenile delinquency and a kind of outlaw lifestyle. High School Confidential being most famous in my book because it actually features Jerry Lee Lewis playing rock and roll in on a flatbed truck. Well worth the opening scene of that movie. The Beats were another group who became very noteworthy for their drug usage in the 1950s, especially. And they were, sort of following in that romantic tradition of being, outcasts and, living in cities like San Francisco and in Greenwich Village in New York and traveling to Mexico and Morocco. And, Jack Kerouac, obviously, writing On the Road, and his associates, Paul Bowles, Gregory Corso, William Burroughs. These guys were all writing about the use of marijuana primarily, but also heroin at the time. And I've got it included here, 100 Camels in the Courtyard, which was written by Paul Bowles. It's a series of Moroccan folk tales about hashish. And Paul Bowles in the picture is the one wearing the white suit, looking very elegant. And full disclosure, the signature there is not from this copy right here. It's from another book that I own by Bowles, but I wanted you to see a sample of his handwriting there. And that's that. And of course, Bill Burroughs, most famous for Naked Lunch, which he wrote in Tangiers. This is another one of his books, this one dealing with pirates and drugs and prostitution and drugs and everything else. But he wrote a lot of times in Mexico and in Tangier. And he stayed at a hotel, which I'm not sure if it's still there today, but when I visited Tangier, I went, and that's I'm in the lobby in that picture down there, the Tangerine, which was in the bar of the Hotel El Muniria, which is where he wrote Naked Lunch. And that's a sample of his signature there. Moving along, of course, the famous guy who transcends the beatnik era and became sort of a mouthpiece for the hippie era and Eastern mysticism and sort of whatever else trend was going on at the time. Allen Ginsberg there in full hippie LSD mode, dancing away. And that's a copy of his Planet News, which I was fortunate to meet him and get a copy of his signature on that. But he sort of has a foot in both worlds. At the same time, the Beats and the jazz people were experimenting in drugs. New drugs started to come to public awareness, the hallucinogens or the psychedelics. And it was initially scientists and the government that was very interested in these. The first ones that they were most curious about were the ones that came from natural sources, the mushrooms, the cacti, and these drugs. But LSD after the 1930s looked to be the most promising, both for medical research, but also for possible military uses. The book Psychedelic Experience, which you see on the left, was a serious scientific study by masters in Houston on the early experiments, medical experiments and scientific experiments done with LSD when it was legal. And the year it was published, absolutely, 1966, happened to be the very year that LSD went illegal because it was starting to get into the hands of young people across the country. The book on the other side, Tripping on Utopia, is a recent recent book, and I included it because it's really, I just finished it a little while ago. It's really quite a fascinating book on the military and CIA experiments that were done during the Cold War on LSD and other psychedelics to see what their viability for mind control and brainwashing and frankly chemical warfare. It was ultimately decided after a couple of decades of study that it was not particularly useful for military purposes. But it's some frightening stuff that they were doing. They were agents were dosing each other, dosing people who weren't aware of it. There were suicides. They were practicing these treatments on inmates, on soldiers, on residents of mental hospitals, and pretty irresponsible drug administrations or experimentation on the part of government. There are, though, if you look, some somewhat amusing video footage you can see of it. There's a classic one where a bunch of British soldiers were given LSD and then their officers tried to put them through drills. And it's needless to say, was a disaster, but it's all filmed and can be found. One of the most famous of the early experimenters with psychedelics was Aldous Huxley, the author of Brave New World, who wrote this book, The Doors of Perception, and then a subsequent book called Heaven and Hell, which detailed his experiments with mescaline. And in the he became very convinced that it had genuine value for self-discovery and for introspection and meditation and possible medicinal use. He became an enthusiastic supporter of the use of or experimentation in LSD. And it should be, you could note that the musical band The Doors took their name from this book title. And one of the most amazing things I heard about Aldous Huxley was when he was on his deathbed, he had himself injected with LSD as he was dying because he figured that would be the most interesting way to leave this sphere, shed this mortal coil, and see what was next. And again, this particular signature of Aldous Huxley's is not from this book. I pulled that from another book of Huxley's that I own that he did during the Spanish Civil War. So to be honest about that. Fascinating how the medical world was looking into drug experimentation in the 1960s. And the Psychedelic Review, which was published from 1963 to 1971, is an amazing compendium of findings and peer-reviewed experiments and articles detailing some rather remarkable studies on the treatment of alcoholism, mental illness, depression, anxiety, smoking cessation that they found rather remarkable success with. But this, as I say, this was done legally when these magazines, this journal, professional journals were first being published, but by 1971, they were not. I mean, that was the last of it. And I'm showing here the first 6 volumes of it. But in 1966, LSD was made a Schedule I drug. In other words, without any medical value whatsoever, and that pretty much ended research, scientific research, serious research for decades. It's only, as we know, beginning now, and it's interesting, and some of the modern people at Johns Hopkins and other places can refer back to some of these early findings. My favorite one of the scientists and the ethnobotanists that were studying psychedelics was a guy named Dr. Richard Schultheis, who was an ethnobotanist from Harvard. And he was always troubled by the fact that he taught at the same institution that Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert taught in. And of course, they got fired from Harvard for introducing psilocybin and LSD to students, undergraduates. But Dr. Schulteis was a very serious, scholarly gentleman who wrote many, many books on the use of hallucinogens and actually discovered, well, obviously it was known by natives, but just as a Westerner discovered the ayahuasca by his trips to the Amazon. And he wrote this famous book on the left-hand side, Plants of the Gods, which is probably the best single book on the natural drugs and their indigenous roots that I've found. Now that's the serious grown-up book, but I find it kind of amazing that he's also responsible for the Golden Guide to Hallucinogenic Plants, which, believe it or not, was a golden book for children and that was published in, I think, 1967, 1968, and was on the market for probably a few hours before people said, "Are you kidding?" And that book disappeared immediately. So a very dear friend of mine had a copy of that that gave it to me, and I treasure that because it's got to be one of the most unusual books in my collection, a child's book on hallucinogenic plants. Dr. Schulteis was actually in charge of the glass plants, which is an amazing collection of plants in Harvard University Museum, and he wrote a whole book on the plants, which is where I got the signature that you see there. Is from his plant book. But I was also very fortunate in 1968 to attend a lecture done by Dr. Schulteis, in which he talked about his travels in the Amazon, and was able to speak to him after briefly. A memorable genius, a really interesting man. And he had footage from the 1930s in his explorations in the Amazon, which were positively inspirational. Of course, this one, many of you have read probably, which is Tom Wolfe's Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test. And this was, Tom Wolfe, a Park Avenue writer who traveled to San Francisco and wrote of the adventures of Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters in their 1965 LSD-fueled travels across the United States, which I would argue pretty much inaugurated the entire hippie movement. This book is really caught. I mean, it was read by every person who was 17 or 18 at the time, and sent most of them off to San Francisco or Greenwich Village at the time. But it's a fun, amusing read even to this day. And of course, the main subject of this book, the main character, was Ken Kesey, who you see here in the bus, picture from the time. And he was the author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. He was one of the subjects in the first LSD and psilocybin experiments back in the 1950s. He fell in love with the drug and was writing about it pretty much for the rest of his life. And I think of him as actually one of the most important architects of 1960s counterculture, for the reason that that bus trip and subsequent involvement with the counterculture community, he was the man, I would argue, that fused all the different separate communities into a nationwide movement, in that, he brought together the old beats. In fact, the driver of the bus was Neil Cassidy, who was one of, is the subject of Kerouac's On the Road. So he's even got one of Kerouac's old buddies, and Ginsberg and these guys. So we brought in the beats. He brought in the rock and roll people. The Grateful Dead became closely associated with Kesey. He brought in the early hippies. And he brought in a lot of the LSD scientists, and even brought in the outlaw bikers. So he brought in that sort of criminal element as well. And thus was born kind of the whole San Francisco movement at around that time. And he was the one, they were handing out those acid test things that I showed you at the beginning of this unit. And of course, some of these were also documented by Hunter S. Thompson, who wrote the Hells Angels book and a collection of his letters right there, The Proud Highway, recently passed on. He was known as an enthusiast for just about every substance ever devised or discovered in the face of the earth. And yeah, is technically, I guess, is a journalist, but certainly a noted experimenter in drugs. And I got one anecdote related to Hunter. I worked at one evening at a show or a book reading that Hunter was doing. So I got to meet Hunter, and he was sort of famous for appearing inebriated on stage, and he'd walk on stage with a bottle of Jack Daniels and give his reading. And I will testify from personal knowledge that when he got on stage that particular night, that bottle of Jack Daniels was full of iced tea, not liquor. So he was sober as a judge that night. So that's Hunter. That's my one Hunter story. Anyway, San Francisco, Summer of Love, became the center of the whole hippie movement. I've included a photograph of Jerry Garcia of the Grateful Dead in his younger days from this book, The Summer of Love, and a photograph of my copy of Zap Comics #1, which was, our Crumb was sort of the comic artist of the whole San Francisco scene. And I managed to hang on to that and not destroy my copy of Zap 1. So there's that. And meanwhile, at the other side of the country, the Greenwich Village and the East Village became sort of the center of East Coast hippiedom, which was somewhat darker in appearance than the sunny West Coast version. But and the drug of choice was a little less LSD and a little more heroin. And you had the Grateful Dead on the West Coast, and you had the Velvet Underground on the East Coast. And I've included a picture of the East Village Other, which was the underground newspaper that was popular around the time. And on Bleecker Street, which was one of the more famous streets associated with the hippies at the time. This particular building was where the Youth International Party, or the Yippies, with Abby Hoffman and David Rubin, Jerry Rubin, excuse me, had their newspaper. And it's long since been abandoned, as you can see, and closed down. But if you notice above the gates, the original sign for the Yipster Times is still standing. And I would love to get my hands on that sign and preserve it. It's been sitting there ever since, and for some reason it's never been stolen, which I'm very impressed by. But anyway, that's the New York Village, East Village scene references, and that's an original poster from the Velvet Underground, which, as you can see, the prices at the time were $2.75. Think of what concerts cost today. Anyway. There became increasing interest in the original indigenous use of drugs as we go through the 70s, 80s, 90s, and even into the present day. And a lot of that has been searching into Native American traditions. And there certainly were a number of psychoactive plants that were regarded as sacred by Native communities. The book, The Peyote Revolution, over there on the right, details the whole process whereby Southwest Native Americans were able to get exemptions from drug laws so that the use of peyote was allowed in religious ceremonies. And there's a photograph of a peyote cactus right there. The Native American Church is a legitimate religious community in the Southwest. I've also included photographs of Datura on the under the peyote button there, and Morning Glory, both of those having hallucinogenic properties. The Datura being a very extremely dangerous drug that used rarely by certain shamans, but not ever really in popular usage. The picture the native healer there and the young man. That's actually taken from Mexico in 19, I think 58, and that is a psilocybin ritual that the young man is being cured of, is treated for his illness by the woman there, who was the woman who introduced Dr. Wasson to the mushrooms that contain psilocybin, which I have as the photograph on the far left. That is psilocybin cubensis, the Mexican mushroom. Robert Graves, the famous poet and World War I, decorated World War I hero, became very interested when he tried psilocybin. And he was a classicist who wrote I, Claudius and everything else. And he became convinced that mushrooms and or ergot mold, which contains the precursors to LSD, was actually used in ancient Greek and Roman mysteries. Just Greek mysteries and Eastern Mediterranean mysteries. And they would have either been using something like the Amanita muscaria mushroom that you see in the center, or European versions of the psilocybin mushroom. And his book, Food for Centaurs, treats that subject. You'll see on the other side of the mysteries of Eleusis talks about the Dianic and Dionysian rituals as possibly being connected to the use of ergot. And that's written by both Hoffman, the discoverer of LSD, and Wasson, the man who popularized the use of psilocybin. Serious research, both. And we're getting close to the end here. I wanted to draw attention to other indigenous communities, like the Rastafarian community in Jamaica, which sees cannabis as a sacred plant. It was that movement began actually in the 1930s after a visit by Marcus Garvey to Jamaica, in which it's a Pan-African religious movement that predicted the arrival of an African emperor just about a year or so before Haile Selassie became the emperor of Ethiopia. And Rastafarianism is, a uniquely Jamaican and now actually spread throughout much of the Caribbean religious practice. In the center, I have there a coconut chelum, which is a Rastafarian smoking device. And that book was actually written in 1965 by the Jamaican government that was just trying to come to grips with what was the Rastafarian movement all about. It's an interesting pamphlet that was written at the time. The left-hand side is kind of wacky. It's a catechism for the Neo-American Church, not to be confused with the Native American Church that I showed you. This was a group of hippies who decided that the best way to avoid trouble with the law was to become a religion. And so they created a religion based on, well, as it says right there, LSD, marijuana, and sex. And they thought if they applied for a religious exception to the law, they would be allowed to indulge. Needless to say, it did not fly. But I managed to get my hand on one of their original catechisms, so it's kind of an interesting book. If you ever get a chance to read that one, it's funny. I wanted to talk India, obviously, was a draw for many, many Westerners. You think of the Beatles going over there and other people interested in mysticism. And cannabis was widely used by worshippers of Shiva, the sadhus, the holy men. I have a picture of one of them there smoking exactly the pipe that you see on the left-hand side. That's an Indian chelum. The bowl behind it is actually for Rajasthani opium rituals. So that's an opium bowl and a cannabis pipe that were used in different Indian sects. And let's see, I think Yeah, last one I wanted to show. That's a little close to the last one. Terence McKenna was a more recent. He was actually a student of Dr. Schulteis, who went off on his own adventures through much of the world. And in Brazil, he managed to find heretofore unknown mushrooms containing psilocybin. I'm fascinated by this guy because he actually came up with a theory. He just recently passed a couple of years ago. I thought somewhat prematurely. He was a young man, but he came up with what is called the stoned ape theory. Despite the amusing title, his argument is that hallucinogens and mushrooms specifically might have had something to do with the evolution of human consciousness as primates moved from jungles to savannas and plains. They would have come across mushrooms throughout all the known world that have psychoactive properties, and that these might have triggered the development of human intelligence. And that's Terence McKenna's True Hallucinations. Um, and if you want further reading, I've included these two. The one, Michael Pollan, the signed one, that's his, if you can make out his handwriting, that's his signature. And that's This Is Your Mind on Plants. That's really, really talking about the substances themselves. And he is doing a lot of writing on consciousness. He's got a number of books out right now. This one's directly about mescaline and peyote and psilocybin and opium. And the other one, Psychonauts, I just finished that just recently by Mike J. And it's probably one of the best books on the history of drug use that I've ever read. It's fabulous. So these are, future reading. And I'm going to close with one last bit of controversial historical theory. A number of years ago, a guy named John M. Allegro wrote a book called The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, in which he suggests the possibility that there is mushroom traditions even in the Judeo-Christian heritage and drug traditions. And he uses that illustration there from a monastery in France, showing the tree of knowledge in the garden of good and evil as being what looks an awful lot like an Amanita muscaria mushroom. Now, if that's possibly true, I think that might have influenced something, because we gain knowledge, obviously, from the tree and the biblical tradition. And then Terence McKenna is saying much the same thing. And the other picture is from no one knows what to make of that, but Jesus curing the lepers and no, the blind, I'm sorry. And that certainly looks like a cannabis plant behind them. Of course, there's two widely divergent schools of thought on whether that's true or not. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is it. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, George. That was fascinating.
Okay.
It is a little past 9, but if anybody has any questions, George, you able to take some questions for us?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'm not going anywhere. Yep.
Okay. Well, here's a question from Brad Cook, our editor of the Manuscripts magazine,
Okay.
Manuscripts Journal. What is the rarest item you have, and what publication have you not been able to find?
Okay, the rarest one is probably or the most valuable one is probably the one by Jean Cocteau, the English translation of Opium from 1932, I think it was. It's probably the rarest. I have never seen Bayard Taylor's come up only once, and I snagged that. And certainly the Burton collection, the whole collection, that's pretty expensive. So there's a bunch of them, but I haven't really checked the prices of those. You can find some of them if you look hard, but I don't know where a lot of them. Some of those I got back in the day, so I'm not sure. I haven't really checked. But that one I can tell you, the one I saw the opium one in London a couple of weeks ago, and they wanted a considerable amount. I think they wanted 1,500 for it, pounds. I saw it in London in a bookstore, so I felt kind of good about that one. Next, sure, ask away.
What's a book that got away that you saw and you went back?
Cab Calloway. Saw it at the
Yeah.
Strand. The book was in great condition, and so I said, I'll find it again someday. And it was signed by Cab. It had that map in it, and I've kicked myself ever since. I've never seen it, and when I've priced it, it's been through the roof. The guy at Strand wanted $100 for that when I saw it, and I balked, and I've regretted it ever since.
Yeah.
Hands down.
Norman Cohen's asking, why no Tim Leary?
No Tim Leary. I don't own any Tim Leary's signed. Tim Leary figures prominently in some of the psychedelic review. But I was actually I started really being more interested in the older stuff, and the more modern stuff I sort of acquired just sort of casually along the way. My real interest was in that 19th century stuff primarily. I met Richard Alpert, and I really liked him as a person when he became Baba Ramdas, and he was interesting and a fascinating and indeed gentle man. I never met Tim, but I also have mixed reviews on some of the stuff that he wrote. So I was never overly a fan of Tim's. So I don't know if that answers the question, but
Yeah, no, it does.
okay.
There's a question from Hans Koch. Do you collect the anti-drug tracts and pamphlets published in the 1960s and 70s, many by state and federal governments and NGOs?
No, I don't. I don't have any of those. I was not particularly running into any of those, and so I didn't. I didn't say I probably should have. No, but I got all the East Village others, and all those early the hippie magazines and stuff like that, which decidedly did not run the anti-drug ads. Um, so no, I don't have any of the just the stuff that you would have seen like that Time Life magazine. It was pretty much an anti-drug tract, and the pulp fiction stuff was supposed to be, but I think that had exactly the opposite effect as what it intended. Sure.
Yeah, I can understand that. One final question, unless anybody else has one. Um, Obviously you have many more years of collecting, but have you given any thought of what you plan to do with the collection once, either at some point in the future?
Yeah, I haven't actually. I've got family that might want to get their hands on some of it. I hope, and I think that's the kind of question I think we could ask almost anybody in the Manuscript Society. What are you going to do with all this stuff? You hope that somebody close to you wants it. I mean, um, there are organizations that collect this kind of drug material, but yeah, they probably got more stuff than I'd ever have there. So I imagine somebody, my family might want it or want to sell it or something like that. But no, I haven't given much thought to that.
Have you looked at the LSD library, former LSD library at Harvard?
I haven't. No, I didn't know it. I didn't know it existed. I'll bet Schulteis had something to do with that.
Yeah.
No, I haven't. Maybe that next time we're in Boston, we should drop in on that. If I'd known, I would have urged us to go take a look at that. So yeah,
Norman Cohen is asking about do you know of a poet? I've heard of a poet named Ira Cohen.
yes, I have. And are you related?
Different spelling's different last name.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
Cohen and then Cohen.
yeah, I
I'm
have.
sorry, Mr. Norman. I'm probably mispronouncing your last names.
Any other questions?
I think that's it.
All right. Let's see. Oh, it's only okay. It's 9:10. If there's any.
Leslie Morris. If you're at
Ah,
Harvard, just look me up and I'll be happy to show you some of the LSD library. So that's Leslie
absolutely.
Morris.
Okay. Will you? Yeah. Let me write that down. Hang on a second. Can you bring that back up again?
Yep. It's in the chat section.
Oh, it's in the chat.
Leslie A. Morris. We'll have to keep that in mind for our next manuscript society visit to Boston.
Yeah, absolutely. We got, Beverly did that whole thing in the Beats a while back too. So, we got some counterculture interest, I think, in the community. So that's good.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, George, wonderful presentation. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us and sharing your collection.
Well, thank you so much, and I appreciate it. Anybody still on the online there? Thank you all for
Yeah, it's
coming.
quite a few.
Oh, okay. Thank you all. It was a pleasure.
Hope everybody has a great evening. Thank you very much for attending. And stay tuned for information about the September Manuscript Monday.
All right, will do.
Okay. Take care, everybody. Have a great evening.